Christmas morning settled over the house like a quiet promise. I stood by the fireplace, its soft glow flickering against the carefully placed decorations, the scent of pine and cinnamon mingling gently in the cold air. I hoped for a moment of warmth, the kind bound by family, forgiveness, and shared history. Through decades of labor and sacrifice, I had built more than just a home. I had built a legacy meant to endure. But beneath the fragile hope, something unwelcome stirred. The door clicked shut behind John with a sharp, deliberate finality. His voice, cold and unyielding, sliced through the quiet. "You're not our family anymore." Those words broke the fragile peace, striking me harder than any blow I'd expected. My heart hammered in disbelief, but my lips stayed sealed, caught between shock and disbelief. The room, once filled with memories and warmth, suddenly felt chillingly empty. I could see the dismissive calm on John's face, the practiced indifference in Melissa's gaze beside him. No remorse, no hesitation, only a merciless judgment hanging heavy in the air. I remembered the countless years, the nights spent crunching numbers just to keep the mortgage afloat, the endless shifts juggling my engineering projects and extra work to send John to college. Every sacrifice was measured, every penny a part of a quiet plan to provide for them. Yet in that instant, I realized all I had offered had been met with disdain, my efforts dismissed, my presence unwelcome. The door shutting was not just an act of leaving, it was a verdict rendered with cruel clarity. The silence that followed was suffocating. The house, once a haven echoing with laughter and life, felt barren, its walls cold witnesses to a fracture that no amount of holiday cheer could mask. I stepped back, each footfall weighted with a growing heaviness as I retreated into solitude. Beneath the shock, a tumult stirred. I gripped the mantel tightly, fingers pressing into polished wood for steadiness against the ache spreading through me. Their footsteps faded down the street, but the sting remained. The provider, who had poured decades into building a future for his family, was now a man cast aside, discarded by those he loved. Yet with the initial pain came a nascent clarity, a cold spark amid the ache. I was no stranger to patience or planning. The house belonged to me. The years of work, the memories, the fairness of justice, all would be my tools. The quiet calm of the morning belied the storm forming inside. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the fire beneath the frost of betrayal grow stronger. This was not the end, but a reckoning. The warmth I sought in their presence had vanished, but a different heat ignited within, a commitment to reclaim dignity, to restore order where chaos had been sown. The door that locked them out might shut the past, but it also marked the beginning of a new path. So I stood there, framed by the glow of Christmas lights and shadows stretching long across the floor, knowing one thing clearly: humiliation was only the first chapter. What followed would be charted with steady hands, a mind sharpened by years of navigating complexity, and a resolve forged in quiet strength. This was my moment to rise, not in anger but in purpose, to turn betrayal into a silent, methodical victory. The house was eerily silent after they left, the stillness pressing down heavily as I moved through each room. The spaces I had filled with warmth and care now seemed vacant and cold, the echoes of past laughter fading into a void. I found myself by the window, staring out at the world blanketed in snow, the peaceful scene a stark contrast to the turmoil building inside me. The years of labor, the sacrifices I had made to provide for my family, suddenly felt fragile, as if a single misstep could unravel everything I had constructed. Memories flooded my mind unbidden. I saw John as a boy, holding on to my hand with eagerness and trust, eyes bright with wonder. I recalled countless nights bent over blueprints, long after dusk, fueled by the need to sustain us. The relentless effort to keep the mortgage paid, funds stretched thin to pay for college, the steady pursuit of a future I had designed for him. Every step I took was meant to build a lasting foundation, not just of wood and stone, but of family and future. Now that foundation was cracked. John's cold words reverberated sharply against the walls of that legacy. His disdain stung deeper than any physical blow. It became clear that the gratitude I had expected was never going to come, replaced instead by entitlement and disrespect. This wasn't merely a family rift. It was a deep fracture in the fabric of trust, one that had festered unnoticed beneath the surface. I thought back to the countless times I had stepped in to shield John from consequences, covering his mistakes, masking his recklessness with my patience and support. I had believed that eventually responsibility would follow. Instead, I found arrogance and impatience in its place. My generosity had been twisted into something I no longer recognized, something that mocked the life I had given. Pain gave way to resolve. I wasn't a man to be cast aside so easily. My entire career was founded on careful planning, strategic thinking, and understanding the forces that bear weight beneath any structure. I realized I could approach this betrayal the same way, with deliberate patience, with cold precision. This was not about fury or revenge. It was about reclaiming justice and dignity, about restoring order to chaos. I gathered old financial records, bank statements, and receipts, intending to scrutinize every detail. It didn't take long before small irregularities emerged: unauthorized charges, unexplained withdrawals, misuse of accounts. The financial betrayal sat alongside the personal one, a double-edged sword cutting deep. This was a puzzle to unravel, an intricate facade to expose. I began outlining the evidence, organizing years of contributions alongside signs of growing misuse. Mortgage payments I'd struggled to maintain alone. Loans I'd quietly repaid while John squandered chances. Investments I had hoped would steer him toward stability, but were met with disdain. These were no longer just lifelines I offered unconditionally. They were the fragile bones of trust that had been broken. I thought about my engineering projects, the bridges and buildings I had designed to withstand the toughest conditions. I knew that ignoring small flaws could lead to collapse. I wouldn't allow this to happen here, not on my watch. I embraced the slow, methodical process, knowing that careful scrutiny would be my strongest weapon. Old contacts came to mind, trusted lawyers, bankers, colleagues who could help me navigate the complexities of finance and law I'd left behind in retirement. I started reconnecting, gathering information piece by piece, assembling a plan that would both expose their wrongdoing and safeguard my rightful legacy. It was painstaking work, but necessary. I embraced it not as a burden, but as a mission. As the days slipped by and snow quietly settled outside, the humiliation I had felt that Christmas morning transformed. It became the fire that hardened my determination. I was not just a father betrayed, I was an architect of a careful, silent victory. I pictured the conversations to come, the confrontations that would require composure and resolve. I would stand firm, wielding facts and evidence like the tools of my trade. This was no moment for emotional outbursts, but for quiet, unshakable strength. The house remained a silent witness, yet no longer a place of emptiness. Instead, it was a canvas of opportunity, a foundation for rebuilding not only walls, but my identity and honor. This battle would unfold not with anger, but with deliberate, calculated moves. I had the patience, the experience, and now the clarity to see it through. And as the winter deepened outside, I found a measure of peace in the certainty that this was only the beginning. The first steps of my measured, resolute fight were already taking shape. In the stillness of the house, in the sharpness of my mind, and in the slow-burning fire of my reclaimed dignity. The day I discovered the full extent of John and Melissa's betrayal stands out in my memory with chilling clarity. It began with an innocuous letter slipped under my door, its contents seemingly routine, yet it unraveled everything I thought I knew. The letter was a notice from the bank, one that spoke not of my accounts but of theirs, and of dealings I had never authorized. My eyes scanned the words again and again, heart-pounding as realization dawned. John and Melissa had been siphoning funds, misusing joint accounts, and running up credit lines with reckless abandon, all behind my back. Anger threatened to surge, but I quelled it with practiced restraint. Years of managing complex projects had taught me the cost of impulsiveness. Instead, I felt the cold steel of resolve settling deep inside me. This was no mere oversight or youthful folly. This was a calculated, deliberate act of financial trickery, a betrayal that cut far deeper than mere words could. As I sat at the kitchen table, the thin morning light spilling onto scattered papers and bank statements, I pieced together the fragments of months and perhaps years of deception. Unauthorized credit card charges for luxury items, bank withdrawals that did not coincide with any shared expenses, even an unexplained attempt to list the family home for sale. The shock of that last revelation was like a punch to the gut. The house I had built with my own hands, brick by brick, the place that held every memory of Maria and our family, had been weaponized against me. I remembered the late nights, the painstaking calculations to keep the mortgage afloat, the sacrifices made so that John could chase his dreams without the burden of debt. And now, those dreams were cloaked in greed and entitlement, trampling on the legacy meant to provide him with a foundation, not a playground. But there was no room for despair. The engineer in me took command. My mind, honed by decades of solving problems under pressure, switched to analysis mode. First, catalog every transaction, every irregularity. Then, map out potential vulnerabilities, and finally, devise a strategy to regain control. I would not allow the very home I cherished to become collateral damage. As I methodically went through each statement, I discovered a pattern of escalating risk. Credit card limits stretched to the maximum. Joint accounts drained, debts accumulating with reckless abandon. The scope of their recklessness stunned me, but it also clarified my path. The house was not just a symbol, it was a legal asset with protections, and I knew I could use the law and finance as tools to counter their schemes. What truly fueled my resolve was the realization of intent. Their actions were not born of desperation, but of arrogance and entitlement. The kind that believes inherited wealth is a right, not a reward earned. And in that arrogance, they underestimated the quiet strength they had pushed to the edge. I reached out to my longtime lawyer, a man whose counsel had been invaluable throughout my career. As I explained the situation, I felt a flicker of old confidence rekindling. A strategic battle was underway. Legal pathways existed to freeze accounts, restrict access, and investigate their financial moves. This was a war of precision, not of force. Old contacts at the bank, men and women I had worked alongside during my career managing large projects and investments, were soon pulled into the fold. I asked questions no one else dared, requesting forensic audits and reviews that would expose misappropriations and fraudulent transactions. The pieces began to move in my favor, a complex web of truth slowly weaving itself into a net that could capture their deceit. Amidst this growing machinery of justice, I found solace in routine. I continued to live each day with quiet determination, balancing patience with strategic action. I knew this would be a long process, fought in quiet offices and cold conference rooms rather than confrontational showdowns. But for every slow step, I felt the scales beginning to tip. John and Melissa, for all their arrogance, were increasingly rattled. Early signs of panic came through phone calls from their lenders, emails from collection agencies, and whispers of investigations. Rumors reached family friends, creating fractures in their once solid front. They were no longer the confident, entitled couple. They were cornered and defensive. In our rare confrontations, I remained calm, my composure a deliberate blade cutting through their bravado. I let the weight of evidence speak louder than any angry words could. The silence in my responses unsettled them more than any outburst ever could. With every measured word, I chipped away at their defenses, undermining their narrative and exposing the cracks in their alliance. I took solace, too, in the fact that I was no longer a passive victim. My years of experience of designing structures able to withstand strain and stress had taught me to recognize the signs of failure early and intervene before collapse. This battle was no different. I applied the same principles: recognize weaknesses, reinforce the foundation, isolate the flaws, and execute precisely. There were nights when doubt crept in, when loneliness and loss weighed heavy. But I reminded myself of all that was at stake: the home, the memories, the dignity that had been so callously trampled. Every small victory in this fight was a step toward reclaiming what was rightfully mine. The turning point crystallized one cold evening when I intercepted a notice indicating John's attempt to move forward with the sale of the family home, without my consent or knowledge. I stared at the document, cold fury rising, yet beneath it a cool sense of clarity. This was no longer just about money or property. It was about legacy and justice. I vowed then that I would not let their recklessness erase everything I had built. My plan was no longer abstract. It was real, tangible. I would use my knowledge, my connections, and my patience to dismantle their schemes piece by piece. The fight ahead would be long and fraught, but I faced it not out of anger, but with the quiet determination of a man reclaiming his life. There was no turning back. The humiliation had been the spark, but strategic resolve would carry me through. I was prepared to turn every obstacle into an opportunity, every deception into evidence, until justice prevailed. And in this cold, calculated battle, I would emerge not just victorious, but restored. The winter deepened outside, frost etching delicate patterns on the windows, casting a cold light into my study where I sat surrounded by files, receipts, bank statements, and legal documents. This was no longer a matter of simple family discord. It had become an intricate battlefield requiring the meticulous application of knowledge I had honed over a lifetime. Every number, every signature, every document had to be examined with the precision of an engineer inspecting every beam and bolt in a structure meant to last centuries. There was no room for oversight. I understood now that the only way to safeguard what was mine was to take ownership of every detail, no matter how small or obscure. Preserve the original language of the text with the same determination I once applied to building bridges. The financial records spread across the table revealed a tangled web of accounts and debts. Hidden lines of credit, unauthorized withdrawals, and suspicious transactions cleverly concealed beneath layers of paperwork. What struck me most was the brazenness of their actions. John and Melissa had overstepped boundaries in ways almost too careless to imagine, as if they assumed I was too trusting or perhaps too old to catch on. But they had badly underestimated me. Layer by layer, I unraveled their schemes, mapping dependencies and vulnerabilities like a structural engineer assessing the hidden weaknesses in a building long thought secure. Every transaction was a load-bearing element, some showing clear signs of stress, others masked beneath legitimate expenses. I identified joint accounts that had been redirected without my knowledge, credit cards maxed out on luxury items far beyond any shared family expenses, and loans taken out solely in my name but benefiting only them. The more I uncovered, the clearer the blueprint of their deceit became. But this knowledge was power, the power to strike with precision rather than force. My training had taught me the cost of impulsivity. Just as a miscalculation could lead to the collapse of an entire structure, so could reckless moves here cause irreversible damage, not just to my assets, but to my own future. Consulting with my lawyer, I learned how to translate this labyrinth of financial irregularities into legal leverage.
We drafted documents to freeze joint accounts to prevent further unauthorized spending and prepared to initiate forensic audits to serve as an unassailable foundation for claims against their misappropriations. Reclaiming control was no longer a vague notion, but a mission fueled by detailed, actionable plans.
Reaching out to former contacts at the bank, people I had worked closely with during my career overseeing infrastructure projects, was crucial. Their willingness to assist, rooted in mutual respect fostered over years of collaboration, opened doors and expedited processes that otherwise might have taken months. Together, we began constructing a legal and financial framework designed to not only halt the flow of ill-gotten funds, but to expose their reckless financial behavior to those who held authority. The challenge was not just freezing assets, but navigating the emotional minefield that came with confronting those I once called family. Every interaction was layered with calculated calm. I chose my words carefully, never betraying frustration or anger in my tone. I knew that in these moments, strength was quiet, unyielding, a force that unsettled more than any shouting match. With each legal notice sent, every demand for transparent accounting, cracks began to appear in John and Melissa's facade. Their usual confidence gave way to panic, evident in the hurried phone calls I intercepted and the increasingly desperate attempts to cover their tracks. The mounting pressure fractured their alliance. I watched as their tactics grew erratic, blaming each other in whispered arguments, making mistakes born from haste. The house of cards they had built was coming down, not through confrontation, but through the inevitability of truth laid bare by careful, relentless scrutiny. Through all of this, I remained steadfast, grounded by the slow but steady progress of the methodical work I had instilled in myself decades ago. I held on to the principle that lasting victories are never rushed. They are built steadily, brick by brick, until the structure stands unshakable. This was not a battle for momentary satisfaction, but for permanent resolution. Then came the moment I had feared yet anticipated, the attempt to sell the family home without my consent. Discovering notice of this action was a dagger thrust directly at my heart. Memories of building that house, of my wife's laughter ringing through its halls, of nights spent holding our newborn John close, all surged up in an overwhelming tide. Yet beneath the pain, a steadier flame burned, one of resolve, sharpened by years and now forged into something unbreakable. Legal action halted the sale almost before it began. I moved quickly to ensure the title deeds remained secure under my name, employing every legal avenue to protect what was rightfully mine. It was a hard victory, but one that exposed the depths of their audacity. The realization that my own son would so casually attempt to sever our tie with the family legacy I nurtured was as painful as it was infuriating. But I turned that feeling into fuel, pushing me forward with renewed vigor. Family gatherings, once moments of joy, became arenas of strategic observation. I watched John and Melissa with detached scrutiny, carefully noting every word, every gesture, every slip. Their usual air of entitlement began to erode under the weight of evidence and legal restrictions. Friends and neighbors, who once turned a blind eye, whispered among themselves, eyes lingering on the document folders I carried and the calm authority I projected. I leveraged the overlap of personal relationships and professional knowledge to assemble a coalition of support. Lawyers who respected due process, bankers who valued transparency, and distant relatives disturbed by the unfolding betrayal. Layer by layer, this coalition strengthened my position. Knowing I was no longer isolated gave me a quiet confidence I hadn't known I needed. Throughout the escalating conflict, I never lost sight of the patience that had carried me this far. Each move was deliberate, each response measured. The preserved the temptation for rash confrontations, understanding that emotional outbursts would be ammunition for my adversaries. Instead, I preserved my composure, turning every setback into data, every challenge into a stepping stone. Behind the scenes, I refined my strategy continuously,
securing documents, counseling with experts, requesting audits, and ensuring every legal step was prepared with care. My professional mind approached the campaign like an elaborate project schedule, with timelines, contingencies, and risk analyses. There was no shortcut, no easy fix. Everything required steady, unwavering diligence. And as the days passed, the gradual dismantling of John and Melissa's reckless control unfolded quietly but inexorably. Accounts frozen, debts questioned, assets secured, each accomplishment was a small step that accumulated into a larger victory. The arrogance that had once blinded them now only exposed their vulnerability. The personal cost was high.
The once unbreakable bonds between father and son lay shattered, and the emotional losses cut deep. But this was a fight for justice, for legacy, and for self-respect that could not be compromised. I bore the weight of solitude with quiet dignity, knowing that in protecting what was mine, I was honoring the memory of my wife, my sacrifices, and most importantly, the truth. In this silent war of wills and finances, I had transformed from the betrayed to the strategist. The engineer's mind that had built bridges now built barriers against deceit. The man who had once been cast aside was now the pillar on which truth and justice stood firm. This was more than a fight for property. It was a reclamation of identity. And with every meticulously recorded transaction, every legal maneuver, every piece of exposed fraud, I drew closer to restoring the dignity and control that had once been stolen from me. The battle was far from over, but with patience and precision, I was no longer merely surviving. I was orchestrating my silent victory. The execution of my plan unfolded with the meticulousness I had come to rely on throughout my life. In the quiet early mornings, before the world stirred, I sat reviewing the latest financial statements, legal correspondence, and reports from trusted advisors. Each document was a piece of the puzzle I had to fit perfectly. The calm of my study became a war room, where patience was my greatest weapon and strategy flowed as naturally as the calculations I once made designing bridges meant to last centuries. One of my first actions was to cancel unauthorized payments and suspend joint credit lines that John and Melissa had exploited for their reckless spending. Making those calls was both brutal and necessary. I imagined their surprise when their access suddenly evaporated, their financial safety net severed without warning. I relished the thought, not in cruelty, but as a necessary strike against those who had taken my generosity for granted. The ripple effect was immediate. Bankers began reaching out to John and Melissa, issuing statements that froze accounts, questioned transactions, and demanded explanations. It was the quiet sound of a foundation cracking under pressure, the first real sign of their impending downfall. I could almost hear the frustration in their frantic calls and realize the chaos churning beneath their carefully constructed facades. Throughout it all, I remained composed. My interactions were measured and deliberate. When confronted, I spoke with the calm certainty of a man whose patience had been tested but never broken. No anger, no screaming matches, just quiet determination and facts laid bare like unassailable blueprints. I understood that the strength of silence, the weight of deliberate calm, could unnerve even the most arrogant. My unyielding calm became a weapon far more effective than any raised voice. This was a test of wills. John and Melissa's arrogance slowly unraveled under the pressure of mounting evidence and financial restrictions. Relationships they had taken for granted faltered as family, friends, and acquaintances began to hear murmurs, prompting doubt and distance. The walls they had built to shield themselves began to crumble, their alliances weakened by suspicion and fear. I watched this erosion silently, knowing victory was a process, not a moment. Each legal notice I sent, each audit I instigated was carefully calibrated. There was no room for mistake, not in financial details, not in timing. I anticipated their moves, countering with precision, and gradually constricted their access and options.
Every transaction frozen was a strand severed from their web of deceit. Every demand for accountability added to the mounting pressure crushing their reckless ambitions. At times, I considered the toll this war was exacting, the isolation, the constant vigilance, the emotional wear. But I reminded myself of all I stood to lose if I faltered: the home, the legacy, the dignity painstakingly built over decades. This was more than a fight for assets. It was a fight for justice and identity. Despite the strain, I found strength in knowing the path I had chosen. The mission was clear, and my steps deliberate. I resisted the urge to rush, understanding that patience was integral to success. Like any project, haste could lead to collapse, and I refused to repeat past mistakes. I applied lessons learned from engineering: systematic, thoughtful, precise. John and Melissa were not unaware of the shifting tides. Their desperation grew as the noose tightened. Erratic phone calls, whispered arguments, and sporadic attempts to negotiate behind the scenes betrayed their panic. Yet I maintained distance, never exposing my full hand prematurely. I observed, steady and detached, while their facade cracked further each day. The strain also affected their partnership. Trust between them frayed under the immense stress. I saw how greed and fear forced small fissures into wide chasms. It was a painful sight. The disintegration of a relationship built on mutual entitlement now crumbling under pressure. Their alliance, once so confident, became tentative and fractured. Amid these tactical moves, I took control in other ways. I secured title deeds and ensured no further attempts to manipulate the property could proceed without legal consequence. Each piece of evidence gathered, each newly secured document fortified my position further. Every legal maneuver was a brick added to the fortress protecting my legacy. In these moments, memories of my wife, Maria, whispered in the background of my mind. Her strength, her unwavering faith in me became a silent source of endurance. I fought not only for myself, but for the memory of a life built together, for the honor of sacrifices that could not be dismissed. That memory fueled me on cold mornings and lonely nights. I also reconnected with distant relatives and family friends, quietly building a support network solid enough to withstand the storms ahead. Their respect for due process and justice reminded me that I was not alone. Their growing awareness of the truth shifted the tides of opinion, weakening John and Melissa's social standing and influence. This intangible victory carried enormous weight. The transformation I felt in myself was profound. From the betrayed father cast aside, I had become a strategist of calm authority, a man who dismantled deceit with unwavering precision rather than explosive confrontation. The engineer's mind I had long cherished applied its clarity now to matters far more personal and complex. Balance and calm guided every decision. Emotion, while present beneath the surface, was never allowed to dictate actions. I learned to wear my hurt like armor, channeling it into purpose and resilience. The path was arduous, but with every setback turned into a lesson, I grew stronger. John and Melissa's world constricted further. The once familiar comforts of entitlement were replaced by uncertainty. Their careless financial practices broke into exposed liabilities. The social circles that once offered a cushion withdrew. Panic replaced confidence. And yet, I remained the unshaken center of this storm, navigating the chaos with an engineer's poise. The measured, deliberate dismantling of their influence and control was as satisfying as it was necessary. I took no joy in their downfall, only a profound sense of justice restored and a legacy defended. The house, the memories, the years of hard work, they were worth every calculated move. Despite the battles raging around me, I found moments of quiet reflection. The fire in the hearth, the gentle ticking of the old clock, the soft glow of evening light filtering through frosted windows. These small comforts reminded me that beneath the conflict, life persisted. They grounded me, inspiring endurance amid uncertainty. I looked forward, knowing the fight was far from finished, but strengthened by the progress made. No emotional outburst could dismantle the meticulous work laid over months of patience and resolve. The eventual victory would be comprehensive and undeniable. So I prepared for what was next: legal mediations, conversations marked by silent tension and powerful evidence. Each step carefully planned, each move executed with the precision of a master tactician. My path was clear, my purpose unwavering. I would reclaim what was stolen, not with rage, but with honor and steadfast resolve. And with this slow, steady campaign unfolding, I found an unexpected peace. The silent victory I orchestrated was not just against betrayal, but a reclamation of self, a restoration of dignity built on the foundation of resilience and unshakable will. The day of the mediation arrived on a chill morning that seemed to hang in the air like the quiet before a storm. The room where we met was neutral ground, sterile and formal, stripped of any hint of the warmth that once filled the walls of my home. I entered with calm determination, documents in hand, the product of months of painstaking work. The faces of John and Melissa were etched with fatigue and a fragile defensiveness, their usual arrogance replaced by uncertainty. Across the table sat their lawyers, attempting to shield them, but the cracks in their armor were evident. From the first moment, I maintained a composed demeanor, my voice steady and resolute. I laid out the facts with the precision I had cultivated over a lifetime: the unauthorized access to accounts, the reckless spending financed at my expense, the attempts to sell the family home without my consent. Each piece of evidence was detailed and meticulously documented, forming an irrefutable narrative. The documents I presented were not just papers. They were the culmination of betrayal uncovered and justice demanded. I watched as John shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact as I recounted specific transactions. Luxury purchases disguised under vague entries, funds siphoned from joint accounts, loans incurred without explanation. Melissa's composure faltered briefly at the mention of their frantic attempts to cover their tracks. They couldn't deny the facts. The tide of truth was overwhelming. Their lawyers tried to interrupt, to cast doubt, but I anticipated every defense, prepared with counter-arguments grounded in law and financial records. My methodical approach left little room for escape. The mediator remained impartial but visibly engaged, absorbing the weight of my presentation. I spoke not from anger, but with deliberate calm, each word measured to convey the severity of the breach without descending into vitriol. This was not a personal vendetta, but a quest to restore rightful order. I presented affidavits from financial experts, audits confirming the scope of their misappropriations, and legal opinions supporting my claims. The weight of documentation left no room for contestation. They were cornered by the undeniable facts. As the hours passed, the facade that John and Melissa had clung to began to crumble. They offered excuses: stress, misunderstanding, financial hardship, but these fell flat against the solid wall of evidence. The arrogance that once blinded them was replaced by desperation and resignation. Their defenses no longer masked their culpability. Instead, they revealed fractures in their alliance. I noted moments when they exchanged uncertain glances, a silent acknowledgement of their faltering position. Throughout the mediation, I maintained stern control over my emotions. I didn't allow myself the luxury of anger or despair. Instead, I projected a quiet strength that unsettled them deeply. My presence was a reminder that I was no longer the powerless figure of the past, but a man who had reclaimed his authority with dignity and precision. The silence in the room was broken only by the sound of paper shifting, pen scribbling, and the mediator's occasional queries. By the end of the session, it was clear that the mediation would not mend the broken relationships, but it would bring accountability.
Terms were discussed that reflected the extent of their financial misdeeds, including the cessation of unauthorized transactions, restitution plans, and the acknowledgement of my exclusive rights over the family home. Though the road ahead remained arduous, the session marked a pivotal victory, a formal recognition of truth against denial. Walking away from the building, a quiet resolve settled within me. The battle was not over, but the foundation had been decisively laid. I felt the weight of years lifted slightly, like a beam carefully placed to shore up a once wobbly structure. The public exposure of their faults was a blow they would not easily recover from. Their credibility was shattered, their social standing compromised. I had won the legal ground and reclaimed the moral high ground. In the weeks that followed, I observed the ripple effects of the mediation. Family dynamics shifted palpably as distant relatives and friends took note of the revelations. Support and sympathy quietly aligned with me, reinforcing my position within the fractured family circle. The tension that had once been palpable at gatherings was replaced by cautious civility, the silent acknowledgement of a changed landscape. John and Melissa retreated into a defensive posture, their attempts to regain control hampered by ongoing audits and financial oversight. Their access to family assets was curtailed, and the ongoing legal processes ensured that no further unilateral actions could occur without scrutiny. It was a slow but steady dismantling of the unchecked power they once wielded. Their frustration was evident, but my steadfast composure remained unshaken. At home, I reflected on this crucial juncture. The house, once a battleground of betrayal, now felt like a reclaimed fortress. The walls that had witnessed pain and humiliation were now silent witnesses to resilience and renewal. I found solace in the quiet moments by the fireplace, the crackling flames a metaphor for my enduring spirit. The winter nights brought introspection and a renewed connection to the life I had built and fought to preserve. Though the familial bonds were irreparably damaged, I recognized that justice served a higher purpose beyond reconciliation. It restored balance where there had been chaos and arrogance, reaffirmed respect where entitlement had ruled. My victory was not rooted in vengeance, but in restoration, a reclamation of dignity and peace. I embraced the solitude that now defined my existence, not as loneliness, but as freedom. Freed from manipulation, false affection, and unearned entitlement. I learned to walk my path unburdened by the need for approval or forgiveness from those who had spurned me. My legacy was intact, my name no longer overshadowed by betrayal, but illuminated by quiet strength. This chapter closed not with triumphant celebration, but with the calm satisfaction of duty fulfilled. I had endured humiliation, faced deception, and emerged unbroken. The years of patience, planning, and precision had culminated in a victory that was as much internal as it was external. I stood restored, not just as a provider, but as a man who had reclaimed his life on his own terms. The fire's glow warmed the room as I sat in silence, the weight of the past lifting incrementally. Though the scars remained, they were marks of survival, not defeat. I felt an unshakable peace anchored in truth and justice, a resolve that would carry me forward. In that stillness, I acknowledged the profound transformation that had taken place within me. The betrayed father was no longer defined by loss but by resilience. The provider had become the architect of his own redemption. And as the embers faded to a steady glow, I knew that, at last, I was free, undefeated, unshaken, and unwavering in my reclaimed dignity. The quiet that settled over the house these days felt different, lighter, richer, a kind of stillness earned not through surrender but through stubborn endurance and careful triumph. As I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and cast dancing shadows on the worn walls, I understood that this home, once scarred by betrayal, was finally again a place of refuge. The silence here was no longer oppressive, it was my solace. I thought often of Maria in these moments, how she would have smiled at the way the light softened in the room,
How her laughter would have filled these spaces with warmth. Her memory was woven into every corner of this house, every brick and beam resting gently beneath the weight of our shared dreams. In honoring this place, in defending it against those who sought to tear it away through deceit and greed, I honored her as well. The bonds between me and John, shattered beyond repair, were a painful reality to accept. There was no getting back the years lost, no rewriting the harsh words and colder silences. Yet, justice was a greater pursuit. It sought not to patch the past, but to restore balance to a world tipped unfairly by arrogance. In the ruin of a fractured family, I found a steadiness, a reaffirmation that respect and dignity cannot be compromised without consequence. This victory was not wrapped in the fiery robes of vengeance. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly,
as an internal restoration, an awakening of a self long overshadowed by disappointment and betrayal. I realized I no longer needed the approval of those who had dismissed me, nor the hollow affection they feigned. In solitude, I found freedom, freedom to live by my own terms, unburdened by the weight of false love or unearned entitlement. My legacy, painstakingly crafted over decades, remained intact. It stood firm not because of others' acknowledgement, but because it was built on truth and honor, on unwavering commitment. The betrayals that had once threatened to cast long shadows were now diminished, unable to dim the quiet strength I carried. The name I bore was no longer a mark of faded affection, but a symbol of dignity reclaimed through steadfast resolve. There was no triumphant celebration as this chapter closed, no fireworks or loud proclamations. Instead, it concluded with a sense of calm satisfaction, the kind born of completing a duty set long ago. I had endured humiliation and deception, faced despair, yet emerged unbroken. The years of patience and precision culminated in a victory that was as much about my inner world as it was about the external realities finally realigned. Even now, as I sit in the dim warmth of the fire's glow, I feel the weight of the past lifting incrementally. The scars of betrayal remain, but they have transformed from wounds to marks of survival, emblems of a journey fought with courage and integrity. They remind me not of defeat, but of resilience grown in the harshest soil. This newfound peace is anchored deeply in truth and justice, foundations stronger than any house built of wood or stone. It is a calm, unshakable presence that fills the spaces once hollowed by loss. It is the quiet victory of a man who refused to be defined by others' mistakes or disregard. In these moments of stillness, I reflect on the profound transformation that has reshaped me. The father once betrayed is no longer defined by absence or sorrow, but by endurance and strength. The provider, once pushed to the margins, has become the architect of his own redemption, crafting a life held together not by others' opinions, but by his own unyielding spirit. As the embers in the hearth settle into a steady, warm glow, I realize I am finally free, not merely from their betrayal, but from every shadow it cast over my identity. I walk forward undefeated, unshaken by the past, and unwavering in the dignity I have fought so long to reclaim. This freedom is my true legacy, the silent victory no one saw coming, but that I built carefully, brick by brick, with patience, wisdom, and quiet strength. It is not a story of what was lost, but of what was reclaimed. My life, my honor, and above all, my peace.